Most people, when they think about refinery disasters, picture something sudden, a flash, a fireball, the kind of event that arrives without warning and leaves nothing behind except wreckage and a body count. Texas City wasn't that. Texas City was a restart. On March 23, 2005, at BP's refinery in Texas City, Texas, an isomerization unit was being brought back online. The operators had done this before. There were procedures, there was a control room, there were instruments. None of that was unusual. What should have been unusual, what would become the subject of one of the most detailed industrial disaster investigations ever published by the Chemical Safety Board, was almost everything else about that morning. By 1:20 in the afternoon, 15 people were dead. About 180 were injured. A shelter-in-place order went out to 43,000 people. Houses were damaged 3/4 of a mile from the blast. And the people who died were not running the unit. They were not in the control room. They were contractors sitting in office trailers, doing administrative work, attending meetings, going about an ordinary workday in a location someone had decided was close enough to the action to be convenient. That detail, who was where and why, is the story I keep coming back to. Not the instrument readings, not the process chemistry, not the legal aftermath, though all of those matter and we're going to get to them. The question underneath all of it is simpler and harder. How does an institution reach a point where the people absorbing the consequences of a catastrophic failure have no relationship at all to the decisions that created the risk? The answer is not one bad decision. It's never one decision. It's a permission structure built incrementally over years, each small tolerance layering onto the last, until the abnormal becomes the baseline and the baseline stops looking like a problem. Let me take you through it. The BP Texas City Refinery was, in 2005, one of the largest refineries in the United States, processing roughly 500,000 barrels of crude per day. It had been operating in some form since 1934. BP had acquired it in 2001 as part of its purchase of Arco. The site had moved through several corporate owners before that, Amoco among them, and it carried a physical and institutional inheritance from all of them. The isomerization unit, the ISOM unit, processed light naphtha into higher octane components used in gasoline blending. At its center was a raffinate splitter, a fractionation tower about 170 feet tall. Its job was to separate components by boiling point. Heat goes in. The instrument package tells you what is happening inside. The operators respond to what the instruments show them. That's how it's supposed to work. Before I walk you through the day of March 23rd, I want to stay with the instrumentation situation for a moment, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to treat as context and is actually the story. The level transmitter, the instrument that told operators how much liquid was in the tower, was already known to be inaccurate. The sight glass that would have let operators visually confirm the level was dirty, which meant visual verification was not available. The pressure control valve had been found inoperable before startup began. These were not discoveries made during the incident investigation. They were known conditions going into the restart. The instruments the operators would be relying on to manage a hazardous startup were already compromised before the process began. When instrument technicians arrived to check critical alarms before startup, a supervisor told them there was, and I'm paraphrasing the CSB documentation here, no time for additional checks. The unit was starting up. It needed to move. The alarm checks were not completed. The paperwork was signed paperwork as though they had been. I'm going to ask you to hold that fact, the signed paperwork, the uncompleted checks, because it will matter. The restart actually began the evening before the explosion on the night of March 22nd. At around 2:15 in the morning on the 23rd, the night lead operator began filling the tower. At 3:09 in the morning, the high-level alarm sounded. The redundant high-level alarm did not sound. It was not working. The startup was then stopped and then resumed. That stop and restart sequence was not covered by the written startup procedure. The procedure addressed one continuous startup. What to do when things were interrupted and then resumed was not in it. Just before 5 in the morning, the night lead operator left early. When the day crew arrived, the handoff was minimal. Whatever imperfect understanding the night team had built up about the state of the unit did not transfer clearly. At 10:47 in the morning, Supervisor A left the unit because of a family emergency. No supervisor or technically trained replacement was assigned. So, consider where things stand by late morning on March 23rd. The instruments are already known to be unreliable. The alarm checks were not done, but the paperwork says they were. The startup procedure does not account for what actually happened during the night. The night lead operator left without a proper handoff, and now there is no supervisor on the unit. The day crew is managing a hazardous startup with an incomplete picture of what they are managing, and they do not fully know that. From where they stand, they are doing their jobs. The procedure is being followed. The situation looks, from the control room, like a startup. Now let me tell you what was actually happening in the tower. By 9:51 in the morning, startup had resumed. Burners were lit at 9:55. 2 more went on at 11:16. The tower was being heated. At 11:16, the level transmitter showed the tower at 93%, which translated to roughly 8.5 feet of liquid. The actual level was about 67 feet. That gap, between 8.5 feet and 67 feet, is where the disaster lived. The operators were managing a tower they understood to be behaving within normal parameters. The tower was actually holding roughly 8 times the liquid they thought it contained, and they were heating it. Around 12:40, operators realized heavy raffinate needed to be removed and began opening the level control valve. Actual outflow did not begin until 12:59. By 1:04 in the afternoon, the 170-foot tower held about 158 feet of liquid. The control reading said approximately 7.9 feet. I want to pause on that image. 158 feet of liquid in a 170-foot tower. While the instrument says 7.9 feet, the operators were not ignoring the readings. The readings were wrong. From inside the control room, the picture looked manageable. The tower was somewhere else entirely. I covered something structurally similar in my video on the 2003 Northeast blackout. The alarm system that should have flagged the deteriorating grid was itself already down before the cascade became unrecoverable. The operators in that control room were not negligent in the ordinary sense. They were managing from a picture of reality that their tools had quietly stopped providing. The system designed to catch the failure had become the hidden first failure. Texas City has the same architecture. The instrument that should be telling operators what is in the tower is the first thing that is broken. Everything after that is downstream of that first invisible failure. At some point after 1 o'clock, the tower ran out of room. Relief valves opened. The overfilled tower discharged into a blowdown drum, and from there into an atmospheric stack, sending liquid hydrocarbon vapor into the open air around the unit. The atmospheric blowdown stack was not a modern engineered safety system. It was legacy equipment. It dated to the 1950s. It had been moved in 1957 because records from that period described its previous location as a dangerous fire hazard under certain wind conditions. That is in the historical record of the refinery. Someone in 1957 wrote down that this equipment in its original position posed a dangerous fire hazard. In 2005, 48 years later, the equipment was still there. It was not a modern flare system that would combust releases safely at elevation. It was an atmospheric stack that vented hydrocarbons at ground level into an open area adjacent to where people were working. A vapor cloud formed and drifted. The CSB investigation identified the most likely ignition source as a diesel pickup truck sitting about 25 feet from the blowdown drum, engine idling. Witnesses reported it over-revving as the vapor reached it. At 1:20 and 4 seconds in the afternoon, the cloud ignited. The blast phase lasted about 4 seconds. All 15 fatalities occurred in or around temporary office trailers. The 2 fatal trailers closest to the blowdown drum, a double-wide with 11 contractor offices that was routinely used for meetings, and a single-wide nearby, sat about 121 to 136 feet away. People in trailers as far as 479 feet from the blowdown drum were injured. Trailers nearly 1,000 feet away were damaged. Houses up to 3/4 of a mile from the refinery were damaged. The people in those trailers were not operating the unit. They were not involved in the startup. They were contractors doing contract work at a large industrial facility, and someone had determined that temporary trailers parked near the ISOM unit were an efficient and convenient place for them to operate. In 2004, the year before the explosion, the Texas City refinery had 122 trailers with an estimated occupancy of 800 people. Concerns about trailer siting near process units had been documented internally as far back as summer 2003. BP emails from that period questioned the practice. The concern was written down. It was not resolved before March 2005. I have talked in previous videos about the gap between the people who make decisions and the people who absorb their consequences. It is something I came back to in the Teton Dam video, and again in the Flint water crisis video. Texas City is one of the sharpest versions of this I have encountered. The blowdown stack was equipment from the 1950s that had not been replaced. The level instrument was known to be inaccurate. The trailer sighting concern had been documented and left unresolved. The alarm checks had been skipped and the paperwork falsified. None of those decisions were made by the contractors in the double-wide. They were made, or deferred, or tolerated by an institution that then placed those contractors 120 feet from the consequences. That is a design decision. I want to be precise about that. Not an oversight, not a logistical accident. Sitting 800 people in trailers next to active process units at a refinery where the hazards were documented is a choice. The institutional frame that makes it readable as routine is itself part of the problem. Now here is the part of this story I think is most under-examined. The Chemical Safety Board, known as CSB, went back and analyzed the 19 startup sequences for the ISOM unit that preceded the explosion. In 15 of those 19 startups, the tower level exceeded the range of the level transmitter, which meant the instrument was already at its limits and operators were working blind to the actual liquid level. In only one of the 19 startups did both level and pressure remain within safe operating ranges. 1 out of 19. The other 18 were completed without incident and treated, in effect, as evidence that the process was working. Nobody looked at a 15 out of 19 anomaly rate and concluded the startup procedure was broken. Nobody decided that instruments going off scale on 15 separate occasions was a signal requiring investigation. Each completed startup was read as confirmation that the system was sound. This is the logic I spent time on in my video on the Interstate 35 West collapse. Survival under a hidden flaw is not evidence of safety. It is evidence that the failure threshold has not been reached yet. Those two situations look identical from the outside until the day they stop being identical. The longer the flaw survives without producing a catastrophe, the more its survival gets read as proof that things are fine. At Texas City, 15 abnormal startups produced no explosion and therefore produced no corrective action. The 16th produced 15 deaths. The 2005 Site Safety Business Plan, written by people who worked at Texas City and who understood what was happening there, stated that the site likely would kill someone in the next 12 to 18 months. A health safety and environment manager wrote in early 2005 that they were on the verge of something bigger happening. These are not the words of people who were caught off guard. These are the words of people who saw it, documented it, filed it, and then watched the institutional machinery produce no response adequate to what they were describing. That pattern, the internal warning, the paper record, the gap between what was known and what was acted on, is the thing I find hardest to write around in these stories. It appears in almost every one I have covered. Someone somewhere had it right. The mechanism for acting on what they had right was absent or broken. There is a line in the Baker panel report that I have been thinking about since I first read it. The preface says, "People can forget to be afraid." That is honest, and it does a specific kind of work in the framing because the Baker panel made a finding that goes beyond human psychology. BP had been measuring safety by personal injury rates, lost time accidents, recordable incidents. The number of individual workers getting hurt in the course of ordinary operations was improving. BP leadership pointed to those numbers as evidence that the safety program was working. The Baker panel found that BP had mistakenly interpreted improving personal injury rates as evidence of acceptable process safety performance. What personal injury rates measure is whether someone strains their back or cuts their hand. What they do not measure is whether the blowdown drum is still 1950s equipment, whether the level transmitter is calibrated, whether the trailers are inside the blast radius, whether the startup procedure has a gap in it, or whether the alarm checks are actually being completed before the paperwork gets signed. Those are process safety questions. They require a different category of attention than injury rate tracking, and they are almost completely invisible to injury rate tracking. BP was measuring the wrong thing. And because the number was improving, there was, at corporate and board level, a genuine confidence that safety was being managed. That confidence was not fabricated. It was the honest output of a measurement system that was simply not measuring the right dimension of risk. I do not think this is specific to the energy sector. The confusion between personal safety metrics and systemic process risk is one of the most durable problems in how large organizations manage catastrophic hazard, because personal injury data is easy to collect and easy to report, and the graph is comprehensible to anyone in a boardroom. Process safety is harder to quantify. A latent flaw in a startup procedure does not produce a quarterly data point. It just accumulates until it does not. The legal and regulatory aftermath was substantial. OSHA's 2005 settlement incorporated 301 willful violations and more than $21 million in penalties. At the time, it was the largest OSHA fine in history. In October 2007, BP agreed to a $50 million criminal fine tied to a felony Clean Air Act violation. In August 2010, OSHA announced a further $50.6 million resolution tied to failure to abate citations after a follow-up investigation found that BP had not corrected the hazards identified in 2005. That last fact deserves to sit on its own. 5 years after the explosion that killed 15 people, a federal investigation found the underlying hazards had not been fixed. The broader legacy of Texas City is real. The distinction between personal injury performance and process safety performance became more formally embedded in regulatory guidance and industry practice. The CSB pushed for stronger trailer siting standards. The push for safer alternatives to atmospheric blowdown drums gained traction. These are genuine changes, and they matter. But I do not want to end there, because institutional reform is downstream of the structural condition that made reform necessary. The blast on March 23, 2005 lasted 4 seconds. What produced it had been accumulating for years. The blowdown stack was 1950s equipment in service in 2005. The trailer sighting concern had been documented in 2003 and left unresolved. The instrument reliability problems were known going into the restart. The alarm checks were skipped, and the paperwork was signed anyway. 15 of the 19 prior startups had exhibited the same kind of abnormality that was present on the morning of March 23rd, and none of them had triggered a systematic review of the process. The explosion was fast. The slow part was the accumulation of tolerance that made it possible. And the people who paid for it were sitting in trailers 120 feet away, having no particular relationship to any of the decisions that put them there. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the 4 seconds, the years. If this kind of story is useful to you, a like and a subscribe genuinely help the channel find people who want to watch it. I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I actually want to hear from you in the comments is this. The Baker panel found that BP was using personal injury rates as a proxy for process safety performance, and that this gave corporate leadership a false picture of how well risk was being managed. I think that confusion, between tracking individual incident data and actually understanding systemic hazard is much more widespread than the refinery context. If you work in an industry where complex process risk gets flattened into a metric that does not actually capture it, I want to know what that looks like from inside. The comments on this channel tend to have people with real domain knowledge, and this is a question I do not think has one answer.